Alright, also Jibu Tinda Tubu Lamrimba or the Geshe Thubten was war. In that Augustin Karshubares now on them Agile on the Jibu Tinda Tumu Samba Johnsida and the Tabaduniki Chike Lodi on the Kihu war, Jibu Chun in the house, Ting in the house also. That Tabadun Lukivala, then Tabadun Lord. So I said that Tarba Lodi gave and the Tablam Tapsia such an easy shape. Adonala Tarba said, lay down Yumum or Coale around Makia Lemba Dele Tarba Dele Tarba di Tarba is. Says that he laid down Yumum or Gio Lemba Tarbi Tarbadi Togudu Sempigeda, don't you somebody gave in Delia Tarba to Lores as he is another Adusine.
So, good evening. So last time when we were together, we commenced with looking at the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, having concluded those trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So building on those initial trainings, now we've come to these of intermediate capacity, whereby the various trainings are presented that lead to the cultivation of the mind of definite emergence, which is the mind that is intent, that is striving for liberation or freedom from the sufferings of samsara. We also then, last time, we looked at the meaning of liberation or freedom. So liberation refers to being liberated from, being bound within the suffering realms of samsara. So being liberated or free from uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence.
Kovalem Gabriela Haleke, Gabriela Nachike Suleke, Gabriel Sumeliake, and Gabriel Dubal Maje, and Gabriel Milike, Gabriel Haleke, Gabriel Aneci, Nansona do Chinekidina, do Chinokora, Dile Matara, Corn Dugores, and Dagizing Yaksho Levena, Sume, Sukam, Sume Kamelake, and then Maya Gemma. Nanson my Geda, so those cordigores, the Korea, the Kari cordigores in it, led and Yomo, the cordigores, tis a led and Yomo, the Tabanashin, Delia Damshashi, Dilan Tarmajo by led and Yomo, Dusin, cordibasan, tis a led and Yomo wongi, Rawameva, call a Giolimba, the letter Kowas and this work, led and Yomo wonga, Rawameva, and the tea, Dusin, Giolin to do state, Korea, the Leo Korva said. Kovas at this one, Kovas. Just a ditargo or did Dele Tarsona, Tarbares, Tarbas Topores, just a leda Numo ongi, round me by Gewa Dile Tarba in the Gemo Chasona, Tarbares. Just a did Danga Dele Targo water, just a did Targoza, did Tarba said, Top Gudu, Sambige, Tarba Dunye, some lodge Makivana, and the Tarba Toyege Tabla. Sigma, said that in the Tarbadunya, some of the Giko waters. Niggas do send the tongue of Tarbadunya, some nota, do Tarbaseta, Tarbadunya, some Dunya Dumbasa to Kisinti or to Sugarwa.
When we talk about samsara, the samsara is experience, or the places in which one is reborn in samsara is presented in either being reborn in the desire realm, or in the form realm, or the formless realm, and within any of the subdivisions in any of these three greater realms. So the desire realm, for example, has its subdivisions of two God realms, as well as the human realm, and that of animals, spirits, and hell realms. And then the form and formless realms have their own subdivisions too. And beings who are bound or chained within the cyclic existence, they take repeated uncontrolled birth and death in these various realms, in any of these realms. And these realms are differentiated in varying ways, but most commonly in terms of their degree of suffering or happiness. And those realms of the greatest mental pleasure or greatest happiness is that of rebirth in the form or formless realms. So these are experiences by far the most pleasurable rebirths. But even being born there is temporary, in that when the causes for such a rebirth are exhausted, death comes. And then one is very likely to be reborn in realms with far greater suffering than those. And this process of uncontrolled rebirth and death in cyclic existence, it comes about in dependence on causes, and those causes are contaminated karma and afflictions. So it is our contaminated karma and afflictions that ensure that we have no control over when we die, nor where we are born. In that, it's our karma that dictates when our death will come and when and where our next rebirth will be. This is not something we have freedom over, we have control over. Our karma dictates it. We do not have free choice over where we will be reborn. So this is the meaning of samsara, or in English, cyclic existence. It's this process of being bound in these suffering realms due to our contaminated karma and afflictions. Then the term liberation or freedom refers to being liberated from being bound in the suffering realms of samsara, and liberated in a way where one will never ever again be forced into a rebirth due to one's karma, but one is liberated from that. So the trainings here in this, in the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, they are trainings by which one trains one's mind to give rise to definite emergence, or most commonly translated as renunciation. But this mind of definite emergence or renunciation is a mind that is definite on emerging from the suffering realms of samsara. In other words, it is a determination where one is determined to gain one's freedom from these chains of karma and afflictions. If one does not give rise to this mind of definite emergence, one will not be striving for liberation. Why? Because one will remain here in samsara quite content, thinking that this is fine, especially the life we have is okay. This then means we will continue to remain trapped in these suffering realms. So therefore it's imperative that one trains one's mind to give rise to definite emergence, because it's only then that we will have the determination to gain our freedom.
Leda nyoma mongi jewa dile tarbi tarbas toku rese da tarba topsedi da denegi tarbasedi sonyondo 당한적이 다 지담이 다 줄로 소소라는 게 tarvasedi 양 시에다 숨 미라미라 연구래 근데 내가 저 낭바다 치료 받아서 받아 되네기 tarvasedi 토탈 미라바라 시에 연구래 당한적이 다 낭비 송여도 다 tarvasedi 토여도 매 tarvas 토여도 아니 지게 양 직계와 링고래 계와 렌지 신감 주요 당한적 신감세고 시에서는 신감 시에서 마시는 예지어로 와도 주선내로 당한적 다들 점령을 미는 점령을 계제 되니 거와 안 라이나 하고로 내여로 봐 냐와 이다도 내소라 디나신다 타르바 토베네 다주마 톱사 타르바 톱사베네 안데 내지용 거다 디니기 내들 타르바 톱사바 있나 디니기 안 가사디 안 지게 저게 다도시네 내래다뇨 라와메바 깨와디 시와요 말에 소수게 라와 예들다 가와 깨워서마 가라 깨워서 소소 라와 예래 라와 예바 채고 라와 메바도 요 말에 안에 되네게 시야다 되네게 라와 안에 지게 양 코리고 토네 강아 균에 아마 대화장야데 고르균 강아 균에 메데 소설이야 강라 강도가 차상 예리바 최고로 제가 되니게 네 개발전의 용고에서 다 다바 토비기 토바에 강사디게리아 슈사디 간에 요르선다 사시디게 야고 안데 진네디 고소소 지 코리우야고 안 소소기 디니 코리우디 아주 디나 아주 나 코리우 가브리엘이야 네 강발에 체마소 나스 땅야 안에 지 출로게 추유 강아제야 매매로 매쇼 매 강아제 망고여로 와당 준이라 오다 타로 톱사게 가서 디게 된 네디게라 되네 용거 말이지 용거 말해서 제가 되네게 탈바 도스친 순고래 탈바 토야 토바 있나 레라 뇽모 오면 라와미 베게와 딜레다 탈바로 와다 다신스나다 다베신으로 와다 제가 안다 되네 어디 원래 되려 다베신서 다바스네 가서 레다 뇽모베 델레 다바로 와다 개와 바실로 주바 되니게 네게 코리오 따위 빼내가 저게 다 지신에다 추다매도로 시여베나 대단 디스나 네 개와 바실로 주바 자자마도 뇽모바 균이 매로 와다 개와 바실로 주바 최고로 세상 다베신선 가르다 바레스네 뇽모베게 지마자에 매바 델레 다바인자 다베신스로
It's important right at the outset that one has a clear understanding of the meaning of the terms samsara, or English cyclic existence, as well as the terms liberation or freedom. So liberation refers to being liberated from taking uncontrolled rebirth in cyclic existence. In other words, our current situation is that we have no control over where we will be reborn, or it's not within our power where we will be reborn. We cannot choose. This is when I die, and this is where I will be reborn. Rather, our karma dictates that. That's why we have no freedom over where we are going to be reborn. But when one is liberated from samsara, one is liberated from this process of lacking freedom, lacking control, because one now has gained freedom, or one has gained freedom. And therefore, this process of having no free will over where we will be reborn, one is now freed from that, liberated from that. So there are differing ways across Buddhist and non-Buddhist traditions, or differing methods to achieve liberation. So this term is used elsewhere too, not just in Buddhist traditions. So for beings who are still bound in cyclic existence, in samsara, they are born in one of the three realms and their subdivisions, such as in this particular world. When one gains liberation from a cyclic existence, one can be reborn in a pure land, for example. And one will have freedom over where one will be reborn. And one will not suffer again. In particular, if one is born in a pure land, that environment, being a pure land, is a land free of difficulties or challenges. For example, the world we're in, there are many natural disasters or bad weather, and in a pure land, one doesn't experience that. In our world, there's lots of diseases and illnesses that one can suffer from. These do not exist in pure lands. So to explain this term, pure land, it refers to a land that is pure because it has risen due to pure karma. And what makes that karma pure is that it is not tainted, not contaminated from by the afflictions. In other words, it's pure karma because it was accumulated and ripened without the engagement of the afflictions. So this is the meaning of pure land. So just to repeat that, it's a land that is pure because it has arisen due to pure karma. And that pure karma is karma that is not stained or tainted, but is rather pure. So it's not as tainted by the afflictions.
tarba tobudu sempige tarba donyengi nga somebody and tarba donyengi dumbade samno ki gogo re dangan zole 고디 고고래 디 여바이나 tarba 토베기 된다라 아니 베수시고래 베수시네 아니 베수 제바이나 달에 tarba 토에 토고르와 내가리네 디 제기 돈여기 듬바치메나 예나 디 레가디 제를 자와 고송고와 자와 고송면나 디 듬제 튼투고르와 제사 당보한 저기 제사 디 나시 레가리네 디 제력이 돈여기 듬바디 기 고고르와 디 나시 당한서 당보라 타르바 톡구도 선배 돈여기 듬바디 기 고고래 다디 예체쇼 디량한 주냐 걸라 지사다 디게 고고래 지사다 디네 자다 디게야 탑람 가르쳐 올 그때 가는 삼당지 타르바 톡구도 선배게 삼로 게야 탑람 가르 삼당 고래 가는 게게 탈배주 지고래 세바이나 나델야 디 니셰들라 디 and mata the share in my share, tablan did it in some numbers, tabato ye some geala, doing somebody gealia, that the geag and that tablam some shada, cartangers, to sustain what I said in my share.
The primary focus of of this chapter is to develop this determined attitude of I want to gain liberation. So we have to make great effort to cultivate this yearning for freedom, for liberation. And once such an attitude has been cultivated, then we will have as the very focus of our life, our striving for liberation. So therefore it's imperative that we cultivate this aspiration for freedom, that we cultivate this deep and abiding yearning to gain freedom from the afflictions and the contaminated karma that our afflictions create. So to develop this deep and abiding yearning requires an extensive presentation and deep inner reflection. So this is what is presented here and where we will continue looking at from now.
Session147 Delani Karesene, Dudin Korvi Yemik Samba, and the Gunjun Korvigi and Jukrim Samba was a Dushina Sam Dang or SS Desan such an issue.
So now we're turning to the text where we concluded last time. So at the bottom of page 154. So this has 2 points. So what has 2 points? We see the outline there, the methods for generating the mind striving for liberation. This has 2 points. 1, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. And 2, contemplating the stages of involvement in cyclic existence, the origins. So that second point we'll come to on page 167, it's the next chapter, chapter 12. Until then, we're looking at the first point, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering.
군조 동아대 하고 와서 동아 시아바자 되네 군조 봉화자 되네 고봉원데 지네 람고마 자세 두스네 된시고 두스도 담보 동아 손바래 되네 딘하신 저기 냠는 집이 갑라 담보 동아에 삼다 땅고 거래 동아디 진짜 두딘지 삼땅 거래 제자데다 두딘지 코위 님이 삼바세 두딘세야디 코위기 꾀레스 되네 꾀인 바 통고 거래서 디 삼땅고 거래서 두딘 코위 님이 삼바세야디
So we see in these 2 outlines the truth of suffering and the origins, or the truth of origins. So this points to the primary topic here, which is the 4 noble truths. It's through recognizing the 4 noble truths that one will give rise to. It's recognizing the 4 noble truths, which is the method for generating the mind striving for liberation. That's actual outline. So the 4 noble truths, or So this, as just says the translator, noble, is actually the word for Arya being. So they're just the translators use the English instead of Arya being. So in, I think, a clearer way, instead of saying 4 noble truths, is the 4 truths for Aryas. So that's just an aside. It gives more meaning to that term. But to talk about the 4 noble truths, the Buddha taught them in his very first teaching, which shows its great importance. So his very first teaching, the first time he turned the wheel of Dharma, was at Varanasi, and there he taught the 4 noble truths. The first being the truth of suffering, the second being the truth of origin, the third, the truth of cessations, and the fourth, true paths. And the Buddha in Varanasi taught that true sufferings are to be known, true origins are to be abandoned, true sufferings are to be actualized, and true paths are to be cultivated. So the first there, true sufferings, these are to be known. In other words, we need to come to know what is meant by suffering. We need to come to know it within ourselves, recognize it within ourselves. So this then is the first of the 4 truths for Aryas, the noble truth of suffering.
chi du de se chi da nang ni sha shuo de chi da nang chi se de an ju da ye chi gu yi ma du bi zi xin de na sa la so ba gu yi ma du ba xin na sa dang de ne ge chu la so ba de ne le ni ong ge chi da nang so chi du ma se da nang ni du ma du de sa chi du de nang ge du de sa sha shuo de chi da chi du de la de 레다 녀모 원기 기티 베게 나 사추메로 나서바 대소는 지도 대세워 차고래 지사딩한 저기 베징한 저기 베지다야게 되게 다 뒤로와 단 난기 두딘 두세대다 규규 뒤배 아주 풍봉아 보디 사진 예월리 풍봉아 해야 되라 당한 저기 안 저기 풍봉아 되라 사진 예월리 풍봉라고 그래 제사 디디 두대래 제사다 두딘 두스티 두딘 디당 저 니를 두딘 요코리 님의 삼바세 두딘 디세데 가르치를 두딘 라고래 대체베 두딘 다봉을 송고가 나보다 디다 가르치를 두딘 라고래 디 두디레스 제데다 가르치 라고래스데 레다 녀모 준비게 최디게 두딘 라고래 제사다 나주기 레 나주기 풍봉아 보디 레다 녀모 준비 풍봉아도 두디레스 디나시 레다 녀모 준비치 나 사주멜론 라소바티기나 두디레스 다 두디에서데 디 안데 디레체 다디 안다 다디 괴인 바데 괴인 간에스간에 두스 무인니술다 괴인 삼바시데 그런 거 무인니술라 간에스도 안주 삼마당당라 간에스 땅고래 딩에 삼당하나 따와 나신 공무인니술 임바 퉁기데 퉁미도 디 삼다야 되다 디 삼당고 고래 제가 그 두디 요코르 님이 삼바셔야 돼 두디에서 레다 녀모지 풍봉아 수지 풍보 소위 풍보 두시 풍보 두시 넘버시 풍봉아 되러와 제가 레니 원기 중에서 걸다 레다 녀모지 풍봉아 되라 두디 풍보라고 그랬어
As you see from the first outline, contemplating the false or cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. So this chapter now will present in great detail what is meant by the first noble truth, true sufferings. But just to talk about it, to give an introduction to what is meant by suffering. So it can be presented in different ways, but to present in brief, we can say there's outer and inner suffering. That which is external to our body and mind, and then our inner, our body and mind. So the outer suffering refers to the entirety of our environment, of our world. So this, by saying the world, it means the planet and everything within, but it's actually everything that we utilize that is created or naturally arises in the environment. So everything apart from our body and mind. Our body and mind are referred to in this division as our inner sufferings. Or to express it in a more usual way, the body and mind, these will be our contaminated aggregates or our appropriated aggregates. So our body and mind, these are then referred to as the inner sufferings. The further way to understand what is meant by true sufferings is that it's anything that has arisen from contaminated karma and afflictions. So our entire outer environment, from the things that we utilize as well as the world and everything natural within it, has come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, everything in our world is an illustration of a true suffering. So too, in terms of the inner sufferings, are our body and mind, in that these are contaminated aggregates, they are appropriated aggregates, and they have come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, they too are a true suffering. So therefore, in brief, a true suffering is something or anything that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma and afflictions. To come to know suffering, so the Buddha said true sufferings are to be known, true origins abandoned, true cessations actualized, true paths cultivated. So to come to know true sufferings, one needs to look at the very essence of what is this, our outer world and our inner world, to come to know what its very essence is, and in reality what it is, its essence. And in this way, we come to see that they are true sufferings.
Nisudi yabu ha koba ina da dele de tar udu sempe samlo di ko rangshu gile yongore pene ngarazo jala ji so ji mo de na kan so bi da yaben di gedi na ji ma di de yuen ja ya tong yo bane ne ji jala tong de bi da ne ji ma ji wa ro xiong ra ma ji da di gedi na de ne da di de ko ye min sempe ge da di de pa yu xie sa ba ji yo sempe sam ji li ro di Gyuen chi matong bai na, kwa kiti na di rang biju tante, di ya kudu sambi biju tante yukurwa, gyuen matong bai. Chesa di gyuen chi tong na pe, kiti na gyuen rang tong na, di de gu mi nu sambi ke, tanga to jala ina dagarwa, di gyuen rang, kiti na gyuen rang, ma rikwa de gyuen jang tong to, han di pa yu chi, saba chi daya ke tabshi di li yukurwa da. Ane nga zu ki, yang ni mi lu tsa shandal zong bai na, shandal yu shaya na gari da jigirwa, gyuen chi tong 나 미나 다가로 소소 조금 편지 태 지네 파자들의 교회로 지 망고 통하네 니님들 저 지금 되면도 그 교회 망고 통하되 데레 저 지금 맞혀 봐 느끼시 말이야 그 마투야게 답다야게 베지지기로 와다죠 교회로 통 교회 마도나 야세 투야 당한 용으로 와다 야세 투야 되 용으로 와 제가 니기 난주 이동원이 있어다 차이도 와 젤라지네 칼라시세 칼라시네 디 느기요 교회로 지 통하네 디 칼라데 마사야게 탑시 다야 샨딜에 야가지 다 한자라이나 다 미네 다 가르나치 꾀인지 통하나 아니 델레 타르게 삼로디 리고로 어디나시 아주기 풍부요다 콜베네 델레야 꾀인지 통하도 아 델레데 타르고도 선배 삼로디 라슈 리고로 대인자다 코위기다 세상 타르바등에 삼바게야 콜위기 동에 대도 코리 균디게 삼당고래 디 삼당도 어딜에 어다 균이 델레 타고 선배 삼로 리기리에서 오다 세상 코리 타버더니게 삼마게 계획에 탑람텔라 코리 동아디게 두시네 균 삼당으로서 두디엔 코리 님이 삼바하셔야 돼. 다 김전으로 디래다. 진짜 두디엔 코리 님이 삼바하셔야 돼. 타버더니게 삼마게 디 가서 두디엔 코리 님이 야고 통바이나 타바드에 삼로디 델레 타고 선배 삼전 일레 기투고로 디게 그거자 한 제산 두디온 코레 예매 삼바자 당고 두디는 코레 예매 받바 직 장고래 따고래서 도시네.
So if we look if you have the book in front of you and you see these two outlines, the main one in the middle, page 154, and then the first subdivision at the top of 155, we see that the method for generating the mind striving for liberation is through, firstly, contemplating the faults of cyclic existence, the truth of suffering. So, reflecting deeply on true sufferings is incredibly important because this is the method by which one will give rise to a deep yearning for liberation from the situation we are in. And this is imperative because right now we are really blind to the reality of our situation. Our samsaric home, in other words, the state of our mind and our body and our world, it feels very comfortable, secure, safe almost, because we are so used to it. One needs to delve into this presentation in a personal way to really recognize how we misperceive reality, how what we perceive as being satisfactory or even pleasurable is actually naturally subject to suffering. So, for example, if you're very happy with your car, you're not going to think to change it. You won't be interested in advertisements. You'll drive past dealerships. It won't draw you at all. If your car keeps breaking down, if it smells bad, if it's expensive to keep repairing it, you'll be thinking about replacing it, and you'll start to do some research on how you can replace your car. Why? Because you've seen the faults of it. Likewise, if a dear friend, you suddenly start to have regularly strong arguments with them, you're not going to want to hang around with them anymore because that relationship, you now see it actually as not so reliable. This friend is not so reliable anymore. And you're going to want to distance yourself from them. Well, likewise, if you're regularly getting ill and you go to the doctor and it turns out you've developed a food allergy, when you truly recognize for yourself, every time I eat something particular, I get very sick. That same food that you've maybe enjoyed for many years, you'll now look at it with an aversion because you'll know that just partaking in it will not lead to any happiness, but in fact, ongoing pain. So this is the recognition we need to come to in terms of our samsaric existence. And the first part, there's two sub-outlines. The first is through looking at true sufferings. Because it's in this way we come to recognize that the term is contaminated phenomena. So it's anything that has arisen due to contaminated karma. So in our natural world, our created things, and this body and mind, anything that has come about in dependence on contaminated karma is naturally subject to suffering. And therefore, when we recognize that, we truly recognize that, an aversion will arise to this situation we are in. We'll want to be liberated from it. Because we recognize that our environment, as well as ourselves, are contaminated due to the causes that have led to this. And we want to gain liberation or freedom from this situation. So this is how the deep yearning for liberation is developed through reflecting on true sufferings.
Bendigo Korean Samba said to myself, Chazadang to do a demba said, so the you Pumbo de la Samta, Geshe out to that Yamlenji, Kabla, Nambo Chilugi, Tishin La Soba sometime, Sosugi, Pumbole, Sosugi Pumbole sometime. Chazadang to some nala carrying worse in it. Mans and Pumbo got Tabatin by 1,000 years around Chula. Cheza Pumbo one is to the Midawari, Chimato, got Tabatim Unimere. Cheza Danga to get doctor Tabatin. The Tabazina got some person and some Langan, Chia made in Gidina, Yeding and Soji Dingo, that some Naliore, that you have the Penanga kitchen in the Rapa did it, or the Anyama did that did the chats had said that the chick she do said, then she had Rapa Kichiba did some gore. In that sim dingli ya han ye le ya ngda ta ba jin de ga re yo le sen nga zo ta ro ga re yo sen o nga lo nye ma di che we ni ma di che so su ra long nye ma lo ma be nye le yo ba sim go re mo ne yo re be sen yo ma ro ba so su nga di ye che ta nga zo da sam ma ga so ta 균에 마치 버제 로망보 되게 삼다가 알로지 마디지 디토긴 디지기서 곧파 균에 교매제 유어진의 말로 안 되바로 시선 삼다제 안가디 뭐반 디지 디토긴 디토기서 체시니한테 용으로 영아마디 기승의 마디시 인데시에스로 하다 너도 슝으로 제가 두 디삼을 등한주 유어균에 몇년만에 다대버두세 다대는 뭐반 부 조딩에 삼던 거랑 아주게 삼난 한지 되는 디어래 다 심주하고 삼다베네 나 저녀마 여러베스네 요 말에 다대가서 여딩인데 비능아서 로세 지다베네 단로 죽실에 침베네 내내는 롱 우지 멀고로 와 제상 내내 여에 단가 내내 여랍나 로 죽지담바디 내내 여라고 와요 말와 제자디 다등아 로 죽지담바래 안 결혼 내내 여래 디녀마 여래 세베나 아니 야요 말와 다다들 로 죽지담바디 로 제마디 지긴 여래 랍나 삼다바나 안 로 제마지도 로 두지지 차로 로지 마 차로 마도 다들 로 죽지담바디 다가라면 되고 말와 제자디 삼주 나라야 아주 균의 지혜 매되게 예만의 예대 마음반의 조대 삼당고데 십수와 삼다나 디 조회 매되게 님들이야 지적해 제 어두신의 총 교화조되게 차고로 어두신의 삼다वे나 그래서 답을 땜부 요말에 세상은 삼로 현지게 답을 짐바 나신지 되라 답을 레베슨 답을 말해 미지 기지 지네 교화 유도를 맞다고 되면 말해서 어디뭐 뒤좀 뭐인지 수신고 월당하죠 다 두딘 코르에 님이 삼세야 제가 되네게 답을 땜부 삼다는데 노트리에스 대주 교회에 샤세다 하고 월와
True sufferings relates to everything that has arisen from contaminated karma. So I mentioned there's outer and there's inner. So the outer refers to everything outside of our body and mind. And then inner would refer to this body and mind in this division. So when one is engaging in reflection, in meditation on true sufferings, whilst one can reflect on the outer world, primarily, one's focus is on the inner world. And here, I mean all 5 appropriated aggregates, the body and the mind. This is where our focus needs to be, not on the outer world, but on our own 5 aggregates, our body and mind. Firstly, we need to recognize how we naturally relate to our aggregates, to our body and mind, which is not in accordance with reality. We relate to ourselves as being permanent. Permanent as in unchanging. So the meaning of permanent is unchanging, not everlasting, but unchanging. So we relate to our body and mind as if it is unchanging. So perhaps hearing that you'll think it's a little strange because we all know our body changes. Today I feel like this. When I was smaller, I was smaller, etc. So we do recognize, hang on, but how can you say I relate to myself as unchanging when I've certainly grown from being an infant to a child to an adult? So on a superficial level, we recognize our body and mind changes. But the way we relate to our body and mind is not as something that changes momentarily, but as something unchanging. This is why we think of ourselves as 5 years ago and now as being pretty much the same. Whereas when we think clearly, we know that, for example, our body on a cellular level has changed radically, and our way of thinking is changing every moment. But that's not how we naturally relate to ourselves. We naturally think of ourselves last week, last month, 5 years ago. This is the same person. And likewise, when we make plans for our future, we think of how things will be in the future, we are thinking of ourselves as we are now, and we will be then. So, on a superficial level, we can intellectually easily recognize that our aggregates change momentarily. But the way we innately or naturally relate to our aggregates is actually as if they are permanent. So this then we need to look at repeatedly to come to shake ourselves or break ourselves free from this natural way of thinking of ourselves and come to recognize that relating to our aggregates as permanent is an error. Rather, our body and mind is changing momentarily.
And in it, that I'm going Pumbo Tigelia, Dunga Dimbas, that Dunga said, and Dunga Dilla, Manzu Kisima, Shivara, Dunga, Dunga, Chabatishi, Dunga said, Sum Shivore, Tanganzo, how where did Dunga how wore. Dunga said it, Manzania as a tire that in the Toa, Trawan, Dunga Shura, Dunga, Dinganzo how wore. Sazan Dunga said, Dunga Sebi, Tablam, Manzu Tablam Dingore. Tablam den menju che ala sopa treten che ala sopa dene ge tone se den ala sopa den dene dunga se ya kala kansa yung gore dene se ma de yung gore se tablam di den shin gore ta dunga de wa ta gyu dunga se da gyu dunga se ding an gyu dunga se ye su zong an zui de wa ro sam ta de an de wa chin du gore se da gyu da cha ba du ji dunga se den an zui ha gu go ma da kana chi de gyu nya je zang ha gu go se da dene zang an zui da gar ha gu go Dunga digi passing ba dinaji gyu dunga digi dunga yimba chaba digi dunga yimba said that is shin ko re se da sang yu jemne digi denji situation dunga she ba cha wo se da de dunga gyu dunga na chaba digi dunga di ha go re di dang bo ji ha go che go re kan shi me ha go ji di ha mo na de ne an ji 매가 수투 말다고 지하고 그래 삼다 제바제 김제 삼다제 동아 되네질 동아 규에 동아제도 디 잡아주 동아제 디레도 와서 배도신 하고 와체 그래서 동아 시아바 자워서现在디네 자다 두딘 코르에 님에 삼바세디 지상 디삼다들이 디 하고 와체 돈다디리 상유 좀는 이 동아 시아바 자 송와 나시 두딘 코르에 님에 삼바세 때당 두디세디 예다 녀모와 중앙에서 풍봉하고 다 동아에 동아 간에 세 규에 동아 간에 잡아두지 동아 간에서 또 제바지네 다 동아에 아주 동아에 규에 동아다 하고 와체 잡아두지 동아디 하고 와체디 디리 해서 그렇다디야 동아에 이미 삼바시 디 하고서나 어디 디 규에 받아고 그렇다 규에 샤 규에 하고도 어디 다르고도 데 다르고도 섬 얘기를 해야
Our appropriated aggregates are illustrations of true sufferings. So our body and mind are illustrations of true sufferings. So last time I mentioned that suffering can be presented in various ways, various divisions. The most common, and we looked at it briefly, is that of the threefold presentation of suffering. So these three are the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. So of these three types, it's only the first that is largely understood. The second and third are not. So the first of the three types of suffering is the suffering of physical and mental pain. So this is widely recognized. If one is experiencing illness, one knows one is in pain, for example. And there are many methods that people have developed to deal with this kind of suffering. So there's medicine and other forms of medical treatment, exercise, clothing for protection from cold, and so forth. So there's a lot that can be done to overcome temporarily the suffering of physical and mental pain. The second type of suffering, the suffering of transient happiness, or more literally translated as the suffering of change. So the suffering of transient happiness refers to things that we consider to be happiness. So everything that we take pleasure in, that we desire because we see it as the attainment of happiness is actually an illustration of the suffering of transient happiness. It's not really happiness. So this second type of suffering is completely unknown to us. So remember when the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, he said the first truth, true sufferings, is to be known. So of this threefold division, this first type, suffering of physical, mental pain, this to a large degree is known. But the second, the suffering of transient happiness, this isn't known at all because it's perceived as happiness. And the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this we do not recognize at all. So therefore it is completely unknown. So when the Buddha taught that suffering is to be known, he was referring to these three types of suffering, of which only the first, the suffering of physical and mental pain, this is largely known. But the other two types are completely unknown, the suffering of transient happiness and the suffering of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. It's through coming to know all these, in other words, to recognize what they are and the dominant role they play in our life, that we will give rise to this wish for liberation from these sufferings. We will give rise to a wish to be liberated from these three sufferings that have arisen from contaminated karma and afflictions. Therefore, it's these three sufferings that we need to know in order to give rise to a wish for freedom from them.
Bendigo chene jisada ngaran juye samlo nala ngaran jungoni phongboji la dong ka samita bare de ngaran ju samlo langye nala dawa jima da chen yo re jere da ngaran juye da oni ngaran juye da gyu donga se de oni donga re de ngaran ju dewa samda dewa jing yo re jisa donga wala dewa jimba dene ngaran ju phongboji mi zangwa yin ba la zangwa jimba ngaran ju le zangwa jimba re ngaran samlo nala zangwa jing yo re ina dön la zangwa ma re samlo nala dewa jingor dönla dewa mare samlo nala daba jingor dönla daba mare mi daba re 지상 도쇼차 왜니 미팅 받지 진대요 제자다 다도 주바 진거래 다도 주바 진거 될라 다도 맞아 버려서 제자디 삼도 두신의 삼단에도 두딘 코리에 님이 봐서 두신 두딘데 다 두딘데 두시 하고 요도 얘네 가지고선 다 딜에 타고도 선배 삼단에 삼디 디데 명문 디 방고 딜에 타고 선배 삼로 리고래 다디 매가 가나스 데 가나스 용거래서 왜다 데네 가나 용 데 가나스 매바 저거를 선배게 삼로 리어도 데네 안티 가나스 레바래 가나스 용거래서 매서 제바체도 데네 군중 코리에 주름 삼바세 리고다 제자데 안 제자다 등어도 교가를 텐데서 레다 녀모 규다 게마바 규다 게를 텐데 기고를 니 가를 텐데 기고서다 레다 녀모 받을 제자다 녀모 레라 텐데 기고도 와서 다 레디야 아니 디긴 녀모 받을 리도 와서 제자다 레다 먼저 코리에 동아 두디니 규디다 군중 된 받을 레다 녀모 받니 레샤스 제데네 고 델레 테네 안 코발마 기도 와스미데 군중 코리 주림 삼바세도 유 군중라 테네 코발마 주세도 코발마 개발렘바디 하고 그래서 테네게 삼단도 하고 그래서 테네 삼단 그래서 니바들라 담보 두팅기 코리에티 두시네 삼다 테네 두팅기다 유디 가랄리오스네 가랄리오스네 달규 레다 녀모 발레든 리기도 와세베 누친다 델레야 삼단 그래서 군중 나당보 동아디 몇째 땅 풍부 동아디 야부 민두 선배 삼리기로 다디 매바 간에서 용기나 디매 방야기 디 매바서 선배 삼리기로 하다 디균 통하대 다디 가르디 간에서 기구를 선배 삼단도 고 율이야 고 용당 간에서 용스는 고 율이야 제바지로 그래 다 간에서 율이 기는 기구를 쓰베다 레다 녀모 발레 되는 기 레레 되는 기구 봐 레대야 기 녀모 발레 되는 용고 봐대 제자다 동아딘바디 유디다 레다 녀모비 바다 하고 오래제 제가 레다 녀모 발레 되네다 주고도 제가다 두셔 삼다데 군중 코리 주림 삼다데 디세월
reflection leads us towards radically. This reflection leads us to radically shake up how we relate to our aggregates, coming to recognize how deeply deceived we have been throughout this and previous lives. That the way we relate to our body and mind, our aggregates, is completely mistaken. We conceive of our aggregates as being unchanging or permanent, whereas in reality, they are impermanent. They change momentarily. We also relate to them as being pure, when naturally they are impure. Thirdly, what we relate to as happiness is actually, in its nature, is suffering. So these three recognitions, we come to these three recognitions in relation to our aggregates, recognizing how we misperceive reality completely, conceiving the impermanent as permanent, conceiving the impure as pure, and conceiving suffering as happiness. This process leads to a deep recognition that these aggregates are in the nature of suffering, that they are unsatisfactory. It is because we have these aggregates that we suffer. It's because of having this body and mind that we suffer. So when we recognize this, a repulsion towards these aggregates arises, recognizing that this is why we suffer. And this leads to the thought, why am I in this predicament? Where did this come from? And this then is how we seek out the causes or the origins of our suffering. What are the real or true origins of our suffering? And that is contaminated karma. And why is the karma contaminated? Because it was accumulated by a mind tainted by the afflictions. So therefore, the causes of our suffering, the origin, the true or the real origin of our suffering, is contaminated karma and our afflictions. In particular, our afflictions, because it's our afflictions that lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma. Here, we now come to recognize this process that leads us to remaining bound in samsara and cyclic existence, that leads us to continuously circle in cyclic existence. We have no freedom. We are bound in these suffering realms, within these suffering aggregates, because of our contaminated karma and afflictions.
Da dinigi le da nyomba le chungare side da nyomba side da nyomba de la Geshe de da Dösha control. Da so ba da dine azu le se de kizing ma da ki bu chung kar she de ge le da mi ge le se de mo she sa so je da ge le mi ge le se azu le ku de she ba ki bu chung ne ga so ge le da mi ge le se she ba da de ge le ge de bo an dan ge le ge de ba da mi ge le ge de bo dine de yungure se nyawa ida dundol ge de mi ge le ge de bo re an la da mi ge de Givili Gitibore, and I was kissing dinner, just a Givili and Miguel Shesarwada. Just on the lake Givili and Miguel. Di Givili and Miguel, young Archie and Yomo Bachigore said. Then Yomo Bacarici was Dösha by your Condesha by Yumure, Dösha contrast. And there, that the Kunju Kapikishi or that the Kunju Shimjucheta did it, says that Pumbo di Harkit led and Yomo Baletinikiaware. Then Yomo Baletini raw Nyomo the Karagaridus and Döcha down control of Yungores. And the young Gadakiwasan, David doesn't marry Passet, he said. Oh, Dusine, she's not laid and Nyomo does Döcha control, the young you Tsawe doesn't maripatile Kesha and Kiawata Hako do that. Digi Tsawe doesn't maripati onge to a child of control of a key. To a child of control care to control onge, she has some just sort of Bala Soba that in it and it Liang and Pasa. And the Dusha gave Dusha walking Dushin, Liang and Pasa, Dushin, Liasach Dushin Kilu, or Dushin, that could you choose him some basi, this year that is up. To call a Kiwa lady, leda Numongi, don't want to make Kiwa lady, leda lela, then a kill to dear you, Kunjum, because a Numo begins to kill to. That dear and leda Numo, but the Dusha controls Numo, but Tartu the doesn't marry but let the kill to us, but that doesn't marry but kill to Dinis the how I did that, Kunju, the nigger sometime de la Kunjum and the Kuru Jurim Sama. Then some do in some day, then let Zawi. You tardu dida maripale in the key do some how go you do Kunjudiba whatever that Kunjudiba how go
Just before I translate what Ken said, so where we are is still at the bottom of page 154. We're talking about these two, the Four Noble Truths, in particular these first two. So to what Ken now has just said. So here we are talking about the presentation of karma. And that is, we've just completed a detailed presentation on karma, where we spoke about what non-virtuous karma is, what virtuous karma is, and that yes, karma are causes that lead to particular results. And we looked at the ripening effects, and there are three ripening results or ripening effects of those karmic causes, whether virtuous or non-virtuous. For example, a rebirth in the lower realms if the propelling karmic imprint was non-virtuous, and if it were virtuous, it would be rebirth in the higher realms. So we looked at that in some detail. So the terminology and what it means, this you have quite some familiarity with now. And this karma, whether it is virtuous or non-virtuous that we accumulate, comes together with the afflictions. This is most obvious with non-virtuous karma, but there is still a presence of afflictions with virtuous karma. This then is the second noble truth, true origins. Our contaminated karma and our afflictions are what keep us bound in cyclic existence. Because whether we take rebirth from virtuous karma or we take rebirth from non-virtuous karma, we remain bound in samsara, whether we're in the higher realms or the lowest realms, the high realms or the lower realms. As long as that karma that propels the rebirth is contaminated and is contaminated by the afflictions, we remain in cyclic existence. So therefore, both virtuous and non-virtuous karma is contaminated. So contaminated karma is accumulated by the afflictions. So the afflictions lead to the accumulation of karma, and the afflictions themselves, whilst there are many, have as their root one particular affliction, the ignorance of true grasping. So the ignorance of true grasping is the root cause from which the other afflictions arise, and then karma is accumulated. For example, if it's non-virtuous karma, we may kill or we may lie. This follows from the afflicted motivation. And those afflictions arise from the ignorance of true grasping. So the presentation on true origins, or just to say as an aside, this word true, the meaning, it is the word for truth in the Four Noble Truths. The meaning is actually real or reality. So you can say true origins or the real origins, or true suffering or real suffering. So how it is in actuality. So back to what Genla said. So here in true origins, or the real origins of our samsaric existence, we recognize that we suffer because of the ripening of contaminated karma, which was accumulated under the influence or with the presence of afflictions, having as their root the ignorance of true grasping.
Denigi da jeza du chen sam da yode an denigi yongore da dene 다 되니기 규디 제사당 안주기 되니기 레다 녀모모 온기 깨와 렘바 또는데 깨왕아마 하고도 걸 깨왕아 치세야돼 하고도 걸 깨왕아마도 걸 깨왕아마 도서는 깨와 치마다 하고 걸 제사 두신 하고 걸 해시래 다 되네 제대다 두신에 되네 다 삼로 숨바데 갈리기래서네 자다 나도 두마세도 두딘세데 레다 녀모발레네 중샤 규드레다 녀모발레샤 제사다 디 규디암 또 타도데 다세 마릭바데 제샤세 하고 이다 다디 매바 소고디 빵고도 디 빵바이나 코에 동아들라 타야라 디 규디 다 매바 마소바데 네 코에 동아 타야 미도아스 세상 코에 동아들라 타고 되게 코에 동아게 두딘 코에 님이 삼제 될라 타고도 타고 바다 디 매바 소다 가는 소고라선 다디 규디 하고 하지 다 규디 매바 소고 규디 마방한테다 될라테 네 마방다 탑미노 제사다 빵고도 다디 빵마도나 네 코알레 타도야 말 디빵 투구여나 다 코랄레 타 투구리 제가 되는사다 다제 마릭바디 네 다제 마릭바디 빵 투구디 투구면도 그 다제 마릭바디게 진하데 가는 징구도 진마나시원이라 두개 면도세 심주시야 되리 거다 다 되네 지도디 다면을 제바지 거다 다면 봐 찍어줘 또 제바제제 되네 간섬질이야 또 거기 동안에 지 다신디 마릭바디다 다 꾀임바 노트임바 그 진마나신 donla mindu sembe da meba to yong de na da di pang tu ge ba ta gu da di lo no zhi xie di da pang tu ye du xie de da ta ba top tu du sembe ge ta ba top tu ye we tong gu da de ne za di to de de ne di je le sum ba de ga ge o da ta ba top tu xie da ta ba top ma ta min sembe ge de ne ta ba de yi hu as da zin ma ri ba de pang tu da me to de 다지 마리바데 빵 투구도 제사 빵 투바자 대빵배 빵바도 두다 빵 투에 빵바도 세베게 탈바 통고래 다 탈바 통에도 되네 탈바 투기에 발 통고다 통에도 다 디젤이야 다 탈바 맞다 탑미도 세베게다 나 고된 돈에 탈바 돈에 삼바데 디리고다 디야디 뭐냐 다 디가수다 탈바 돈에 삼바 원에 디기고다 디가수
By reflecting on this process of how karma, contaminated karma, is accumulated under the influence by, under the influence of the afflictions, and this is what leads to rebirth. One comes to a stable understanding of the process of rebirth or reincarnation. So that as one understands this, the presentation of karma and the afflictions, that leads to a deeper understanding of the process of rebirth as well. This leads to a wanting to find out what is meant by this root cause of our suffering. So if one, through the prior presentation on karma, one will have an understanding of the role of afflictions, because this was presented there too, the role of the afflicted motivation in terms of the accumulation of non-virtuous karma, for example. But when we recognize that whether karma is virtuous or non-virtuous, as long as there is ignorance involved, that karma is contaminated, one comes to further recognize that the root cause of our remaining bound or imprisoned in samsara is the ignorance of true grasping or self-grasping. So it can be called different things, ignorance of self-grasping, Geshe used now. So when we have at least an understanding that it's from this ignorance of self-grasping that the other afflictions come, and therefore the karma we accumulate is contaminated, and this, therefore, we continue to create causes that keep us bound in suffering. When we understand just that intellectually, we will know that by eradicating that root cause, then the entire process will come. Because if the root is severed, then the entire process ceases. Suffering ceases. Liberation from suffering is attained. So thereby, through understanding this well, one comes to recognize that by destroying, cutting the root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping, suffering ceases. But without eradicating that root cause, liberation from suffering remains impossible. So this then will lead one to have a deep inquiry into this mind of ignorance. How does it operate? How it says it's called the ignorance of true grasping, or the ignorance of self-grasping. So what is this process of grasping at this mistaken reality, so true grasping, or grasping at the self in a way it doesn't exist? What is this process? And how can I gain freedom from this? This leads one to come to understand selflessness. When selflessness is understood well, one knows that freedom is possible. That because selflessness is possible, or the realization of selflessness is possible, therefore one can eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping, which means self-grasping can be ceased, which means cessation from suffering is possible. There is a true cessation, or true cessation is possible. Reality cessation is possible. And this is how one comes to recognize liberation is possible. When one recognizes that liberation is possible, then a deep determined attitude arises for liberation. Because it's not just a theory one's heard about. It's not just a wish to be free from suffering, as strong as that may have been cultivated by recognizing true sufferings or knowing true sufferings. But when one recognizes that suffering can be ceased through realizing selflessness, a deep yearning for liberation arises. Then, for the practitioner, the attainment of liberation, and the attainment of liberation alone, is all that will dominate the mind. Nothing else will be seen as important. So this is how one moves from true sufferings to true origins to true cessations.
방백이 방바디 방백 방바 고딘의 토구도 샘백의 탈바세도 다 토야도 디 토구도 샘베다 통영이 되냐기 뒷바디게 되다 탈바도 얘기 개발이다 니 되니게 삼로디 토구 샘베 삼로디 쯤만 많이 받아 기디네 지금 저기 니모 오면다 되네 기디네 삼로 공제다 니모가 기디나 타바 토구도 샘베 삼로 기디네 콜되바이나 니 쯤만 많이 받세 기고래 디게 받는다 람줄에 개발해서 타바도 얘 이제 되니게 타바도니로 아니게디나 야네 야도 즉 인생고도 타바도니로 주나 대생에 좀 깨와라서 되지 내중세 깨와네 람 깨와래서 진짜 되니게다 타바 토구도 선배다 돈이 숙지 먹기도 다 간에서 토구도 선배다 토야려야 탑람 가르두세데 제여데 되는 람데다 람데리고다 람데하고 그러잖아 제가 람데 시발다 타바 토구도 톱나 간에서 토구도 가르치는 간에 가르고는 토구 선배스면 되데 제자다 타르바 토야려야 다진 마리바디 냠보 다음에 보도 베셔럽디다 뭐고네고도 패지 니콤고도 니콤발다 내내 초사 집자 진바도 추천을 줘봐다 근데 내내 냠네 고 띵해진 고도 세베다 되네 디레다 진배 냠네 추천을 진바 추림 송고도 쇠바고도 다가래면 뭐라 쇠바 먹었네 코로 먹기를 했네 쇠바고도 되네 전제 좀 고도 되네 디자미디금다 띵해진 제시베 띵해진 고도스 도시네 냠네리바 어디 냠네 제발에 때내다 더보선베 람딩기 남가 어디콤 디콤고네 대빠야게 탑람 람 냠네리바다 하고 디 하고도 안델레 공자 두고다 디네런다 디 고디 니네 이야기 두고로다 타바토라 다 니네 두고로다
Through this process of first coming to know true sufferings, or suffering in what is meant by suffering in reality, and then the true origins, the real origins of our suffering, and then coming to understand that those origins can be eradicated, they can be ceased, and thereby one will never suffer again. One comes to understand true sufferings, true cessations. And true cessations, one will come to recognize, is attained by abandoning the ignorance of self-grasping. Because it's through abandoning or eradicating the ignorance of self-grasping, that liberation from the afflictions together with their seeds is attained. And when the wish to attain such a state, in other words, when the wish to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and thereby be liberated from suffering arises in a manner that is uncontrived or spontaneous. In other words, now when we cultivate a mind, it tends to be contrived in that we intentionally manufacture it, we intentionally create it, we contrive it. When this determined attitude to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara arises in a manner that's uncontrived and sustained, then one has developed the spontaneous wish for liberation, which is called the uncontrived definite emergence. An uncontrived definite emergence, a spontaneous wish for liberation, this is a path. This is where one has attained the first path. Understanding all this, then immediately the practitioner will want to know, how can I achieve this path? How can I eventually bring my suffering, cease my suffering, bring it to a true cessation? This is where one will turn towards the true paths, cultivating the true paths. The true paths are primarily cultivating the wisdom, realizing selflessness, so as to sever, destroy, or cease the ignorance of self-grasping. And this wisdom realizing selflessness needs to be supported by other practices, namely generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, and single-pointed concentration. So these 6, wisdom and those supporting 5, comprise the true paths, the actual paths that need to be cultivated so as to bring about a complete cessation of suffering, liberation from suffering.
Dunga sheba cha kunjo powa cha gobong de ja lam gomba cha se nyamne du su che ore se jin ba di re ndi na shin dang du di na she de ya che sa da na ju ge ki bu ting ge ra mi lo chang ba la dang bo ane dunga din be ko sam ta de ne di gyu ane kunjo de be ko sam ta de di che le de go ba sam da ha go de de ji go bong du ji go tar ba to bu se be de ye ge den tar ba to ye de na la lam nyam ne ba che de re de na di shi 지부지가다 도스레 제자다 누레 다른 가 소소 지부 삼다베나 소소라랑 거기 동안에 다시 탈바 토고 대장에 남념네 지기 삼바이나 기부 중위게 남이리 바삼다 차르고래 디 삼다나디 다디 소소 지부 삼바다제 거기 동안 타벨 저고도 진바 차상 셈장 현달을 삼다제 다 셈장 탐제 거기 동안을 저고도 제자되게 셈장 탐제 동안에 동알 되는 레샤 제자디 유군존 때마 중화래 제자디 군주 조 다스 다선될 때는 중국다 디방배 방바 탈바래도 디 셈전 탐지 토고 선배게 셈전 탐지 고려 동화 타다 라고 선배 삼다샤바이나 이제 공부 걸어 된 잡아침이 쉬 냠는 시야라고 고수거다 이래 제자다 잡아침이 쉬 냠는 지나 대시 삼다 디탕을 줘고래 다 저주 나가 냠는 집에 다르와다 제사 셈전 탐지 동안은 자고도 제사 셈전 탐지 된 동안 자는 셈전 판도 주가 셈전 탐지 되나 사주고 봐도 니 토백에 사주고 봐 토백에 남냠는 제야지 심바디다 곧 냠는 사바 셰바 남샤 베네 시빈 남샤 차와라 삼다지 냠는 제야 삼바다 레드 나 냠는 제야디 두스토라 다 이유 단 장시세메 냠는 제바 년유게 냠는 제 란제 람예 제바 람 냠는 나야 람 냠는 제베네 디시데는 삼다나데 조사지바래 조고래 다 군노들다 나 잡아치면서는 셈제 탐지게 되는 삼다고래 되네 다만 년대다랑에 삼다는 다 셈제 탐지게 되는 내갑지 두사 말에 수당보 소소라나 지부 코에 동아들 조고도 셈제 삼다베나데 근데 년대다랑에 람냠는 제로고래 그런데 인자다 디페 마시다 아주 나바상이 비기 去年们切的做的马上的地铁的典型的是阿火坏的。
So tonight then I've presented an introduction to the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Truths for Aryas. So the four truths are true sufferings, which the Buddha said are to be known, the true origins, which are to be abandoned, the true cessations, which are to be actualized, and the true paths, which are to be cultivated. So the way that I've been presenting it, and the way that one trains, is in relation to one's own lived experience. So when one engages in the meditation on the Four Noble Truths, one is looking at one's own aggregates. One is looking at, for example, true sufferings in relation to one's own lived experience, coming to recognize how our own true aggregates are in the nature of suffering, or are naturally subject to suffering, to give a rise to a wish. I want to bring this to an end. I don't want to suffer anymore. What are the origins of my suffering? What is the true or the real, actual origins of my suffering? How can I gain a cessation to my suffering? What are the mental paths I need to cultivate to gain liberation from my suffering? So this is the focus on our own lived experience. Then, when one has trained well, then one is ready to recognize this predicament that I am in is the predicament every being is in. They are all beings, all ordinary beings are suffering in this way for the same reasons. Their aggregates are true sufferings. They arise from the same origins, contaminate common afflictions, and the same solution exists for them. Their suffering can be brought to cessation through cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness, conjoined with generosity and so forth. And then compassion will naturally arise for others who are lost in their ignorance, not recognizing there's something that can be done. And that then is the basis to develop bodhicitta. So therefore, this is a crucial point for everyone to understand. The trainings presented here, the trainings that are shared to the practitioner of intermediate capacity, are the preliminary practices to develop bodhicitta. Without these preliminary practices being well cultivated, bodhicitta will not be cultivated. And the preliminary practices for meditating on the Four Noble Truths are what we have looked at, the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, where one develops the focus and the strength of mind to focus on the Dharma. Here, we now, in these trainings, look far more deeply. Moreover, in the practices, the trainings we've already looked at, we saw that there was a cultivation of a motivation for a good rebirth, and the practices that one engaged in were those of ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. Here, those same four, but with added concentration and wisdom, making 6. And those are the same 6 practices that now one trains in as when engaging in the trainings of shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity, and when one has cultivated them well and develops great compassion and bodhicitta, those same practices, those same 6, one continues. Generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom, they now are perfections. So therefore, these 3 groups of trainings build one on top of the other, with the one being the preliminary for the latter. To the extent the preliminary is cultivated, the latter training will come about relatively easily. To the extent the preliminary is not cultivated, the latter training cannot be cultivated. Moreover, through cultivating these sets of preliminaries, what we're looking at here and what will be built on after the bodhicitta and so forth, these are the preliminaries to engage in actual tantric practice. So this presentation that we're starting here on the Four Noble Truths or the Four Truths for Aryas, it is a presentation of outstanding importance for all Buddhists. The very purpose of the Buddha's teachings was to guide beings to gain freedom from suffering. And that is the presentation here. So therefore, what we are embarking on here is of unparalleled importance.
On the day, the Geshe Mochadi, that the Negi, the Shine that the Shingway Geshe Morova, the Nere, is not that in the Atisha, just signing my answer to Motishu.
And tomorrow we'll continue from where we've started at the top of page 155 and continuing this slow and detailed presentation on the Four Noble Truths.
In my Lord Jumas, such an idiot doesn't get him what is the toy on the how where the Geshe Morada, my Mambulosh and I don't know which I'm on the did that the Geshe Mohora and it's all a child way to that do sit in the sugar.
So in our honor heart together tonight, I've explained two outlines. We've covered one sentence, 3 lines at the bottom of a page. That's all. That's all. So please bear with me. I know it's very slow, but what's important is that every time you leave here, your understanding is deeper. And every time that we are sitting together and you're following what has been said and you're engaging in the reflection, it's arising ever more within you. So to bring about lasting change requires slow and repeated reflection. And that's what we're doing here together.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.